And here we are. Good afternoon. I'm Peg Breen, president of the New York Landmarks Conservancy. And it's a pleasure to welcome you to another virtual Explore New York tour. Say Wall Street, and we all have an image in our minds. Glen Umberger, our special projects manager, is here with secrets of Wall Street and a hidden history. So I bet we'll all learn some new things about one of the best known streets in the world. There will be time for your questions and comments later. Once the talk is done, we'll bring everybody back up on the screen. So you can either put your questions into the Q&A, or when we're all back together, you can raise your hand and we'll call on you. So let's start touring. And here's Glen Umberger.
Thank you, Peg. Perhaps the most famous street in New York, and possibly one of the most famous streets in the whole world, is Wall Street. But the Wall Street we know today has quite a fascinating history. In fact, we could spend hours looking at the financial, political, and social history of these few blocks in Lower Manhattan. But as an architectural historian who looks at old buildings all day, to me, Wall Street is a living museum of American architecture, with fine examples of buildings ranging in style from the Gothic Revival to the postmodern, and all of which can be viewed in a relatively easy 0.2 mile walk. But since we still can't take our usual walking tour as a group this afternoon, instead, I want to spend a few moments and share with you my top 10 hidden secrets of Wall Street. Secret number 1, Trinity Church, Wall Street. Okay, so you may think that such a famous landmark has no hidden secrets, but did you know that Trinity Church was once the tallest building in New York City? With a 287-foot tall spire, Trinity remained the tallest for 5 decades, until 1890, when it lost that title to George B. Post's New York World Building, which towered 350 feet above Park Row across from City Hall. Of course, the Trinity Church we see today was not the first building on the site. The congregation dates to the late 17th century, and the first building was erected in 1697, and then later enlarged in 1737. That building, which is seen in this drawing, faced west towards the North River. We know that today is the Hudson River, with its apse facing east onto Broadway. On September 20th, 1776, during the British occupation of New York, a fire started at a tavern down on Whitehall Street that eventually spread up to Trinity Church, which subsequently was burned to the ground. Now, no one really knows for certain who started the fire, but one positive result was that a new Trinity Church would rise at the head of Wall Street. Construction began on that building in 1788, well after the Revolutionary War had ended, and was completed in 1790. In a departure from tradition, the new church building was built to face Broadway, and as an upgrade, the new building was longer and wider than the earlier one had been. Designed in a modern style of the day that mixed Federal and Gothic elements, it featured a 200-foot tall spire, which was a fairly impressive feat of engineering at the time. But that building too would not last very long. After being weakened by severe snowstorms during the winter of 1838, the church was ultimately demolished. It was then that the congregation hired Richard Upjohn to design a new brownstone building in the fashionable Gothic Revival style, complete with an impressive central tower, pointed arched openings, and a clock. This view, looking west on Wall Street from around Hanover Street from the 1860s, shows Trinity Church towering over the neighborhood. And this is a similar view today. Now, here's the hidden secret. If you go inside Trinity Church today and you know where to look, you'll see the original no damaged 1790 building on display. Secret number 2, First Presbyterian Church. The Anglicans were not alone on Wall Street. In fact, in 1716, 19 years after Trinity Church was founded, a small group of dissenters organized themselves into the Congregation of the Church of Scotland and built a modest brick meeting house on the north side of Wall Street between Nassau and William Street. Later known as First Presbyterian, or today as Old First, the congregation held their first worship service in their church on Wall Street in 1719. In 1748, the building was enlarged to accommodate a growing congregation, and the new building featured a steeple and a bell, both of which were signs of a prosperous parish. But during the 7 years from 1776 to 1783, when British troops occupied New York, the church building was vacated as families with sympathies for the colonial cause sought safety outside of the city. When the British departed on evacuation day after the war was over, they left the Presbyterian meeting house in a badly damaged state. Tradition holds that the redcoats actually stabled their horses in the Presbyterians' house of worship. But with their political differences settled at the Treaty of Paris, the Anglicans graciously loaned their chapels to their Presbyterian brethren for worship while repairs were being made to their building. In 1811, the building on Wall Street was found to be structurally compromised, and it was totally rebuilt, as seen here in this wonderful illustration from 1816, showing the north side of Wall Street from Broadway on the left to Nassau Street, with the church in the center. Immediately to the west of the church, at the corner of Nassau Street, was the Tavern of John Simmons, where James Duane, the first mayor of New York following the American Revolution, was inaugurated in 1784. So at the beginning of the 19th century, there were two prominent churches on Wall Street: Trinity Church, seen here on the left at Broadway, with the First Presbyterian Church in the foreground down the block. But by 1915, only Trinity remained. The lot where the Presbyterian meeting house once stood had been recently redeveloped for the 32-story, 540-foot tall Bankers Trust building by Trowbridge and Livingston, seen here with its distinctive pyramidal crown. Secret number 3, George Washington once stood here. Occasionally when I'm out on Wall Street with friends or out with our summer interns, I like to point out the colossal bronze figure of George Washington standing out in front of Federal Hall and ask, why is there a statue of Washington here on Wall Street? Of course, as I'm sure this audience knows well already, this is the site of the former New York City Hall, seen here around 1790, shortly after it had been remodeled and enlarged by Pierre Charles L'Enfant. Renamed Federal Hall at the time, it briefly became the first seat of the United States government before the capital was relocated to Philadelphia. And it was here that George Washington was inaugurated as our first president on Thursday morning, August 30th, 1789. I'm sorry, April 30th, 1789. The bronze statue of Washington by John Quincy Adams Ward was installed to commemorate the 100th anniversary of that event. Washington is depicted right after being sworn in, his right hand extended to the spot where the Bible would have been. This statuette, now in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, was cast after the final sketch model for Ward's monumental statue of George Washington, and both are exceptional works of American art. But the building we know today as Federal Hall, seen in this historic early 20th century photograph, was actually built in 1842 as the new United States Custom House for the Port of New York. This stunning Greek Revival building by the architectural team of Ithiel Town and Alexander Jackson Davis cost $928,312 to build, or about $20 million in today's money. This is a detail from a map from 1852, which shows the Custom House on the left anchoring a full block of banking institutions on both sides of Wall Street. What once had been the center of government, both of the city of New York and then very briefly later of the United States of America, had now become the center of American finance. 2 decades later, the Custom House had become too small to accommodate the business of collecting duties on imports into the Port of New York. And in August 1862, the Custom House relocated 1 block east to the Merchants Exchange at the southeast corner of Wall and William Streets, seen here on the left from this photograph from around 1885. Secret number 4, the Merchants Exchange. Before the Custom House moved to number 55 Wall Street, the building was home to the Merchants Exchange, seen here on the far left in this Civil War era photograph shortly after the Custom House operations moved in. But this part of our story actually starts on the night of Wednesday, December 16th, 1835. One contemporary account of that evening's events came from George William Sheldon, who described it as a night so cold that the East River froze. Yet onlookers crowded on its banks in Brooklyn that night, watching New York burn down. As they watched, the city's entire financial district went from a thriving center of American business to a pile of rubble. The river itself even burned at one point as turpentine leaked from storehouses onto the water, chased by the fire. The whole city seemed an awful sheet of flame. Now known as the Great Fire of 1835, the conflagration destroyed $500 million worth of real property, leveled 17 city blocks, and nearly destroyed New York City in its entirety. Of the more than 700 buildings that was lost in the Great Fire, this one, the magnificent 1827 Greek Revival Merchants Exchange, was one of them. But the replacement by Isaiah Rogers was even more magnificent than the original, with its colonnade of solid quincy granite Ionic columns, each 30 feet tall and 4 feet in diameter. A shallow dome topped the structure, beneath it, which was a stunning rotunda. It was certainly one of New York City's most splendid public buildings. At the opening of the 20th century, as the United States Custom House was moving into their new palatial building on Bowling Green, number 55 Wall Street was put up for sale at public auction and sold to the National City Bank, which we know today as Citibank. Secret number 5, the corner of Wall and Broad. When most people hear Wall Street, they immediately think about the New York Stock Exchange. Technically speaking, the New York Stock Exchange building by George B. Post is on Broad Street, as seen here on this postcard from 1909, shortly after the building was completed. The brick building to the right is the former Wilkes Building, which was structurally compromised when the foundations for the new Stock Exchange building were being laid in 1902. The Wilkes Building was later demolished in 1920 and replaced by the 23-story Stock Exchange Annex by Trowbridge and Livingston, seen here in this recent photograph. But the secret here is something that is truly hidden in plain sight. I'll start with this view from the summer of 1903 of the corner of Wall and Broad Streets, as construction was wrapping up on the new Stock Exchange building. Of course, the first thing you're going to notice is that the central pediment has not yet been finished. And here's the same view from a year later for comparison. Now, you may have never actually stopped and looked up at the sculptural group in the pediment, but it's called Integrity Protecting the Works of Man by John Quincy Adams Ward with Paul Wayland Bartlett. You will recall that Ward also designed the heroic George Washington in front of Federal Hall, and here's a view of both of his works from 2013. Integrity Protecting the Works of Man is an allegory with the 22-foot tall figure of integrity standing in the center, flanked by commerce and industry, with smaller figures representing such things as electricity, mining, and agriculture. And here's another perspective of that sculptural group, which we normally don't get to see. Now, here's the secret. Integrity is not original to the building. In 1936, the 90-ton original sculpture carved from blocks of Georgia marble was deteriorating, and for safety reasons, replaced by a 10-ton copper reproduction made from castings of the originals and painted to look like marble. Of course, these castings were made from the 1936 conditions and not from Ward's original plaster models, which is why I think they look a bit odd today. Nevertheless, this is perhaps one of New York City's most fascinating yet most overlooked works of public sculpture. Secret number 6, J.P. Morgan. Perhaps one of the most famous names in American finance is J.P. Morgan, but you won't find his name anywhere on Wall Street today. Morgan began his Wall Street career in 1871 when he entered a partnership with Anthony Joseph Drexel Sr., the Philadelphia financier who later founded Drexel University. In 1872, the partnership, then known as Drexel Morgan and Company, paid $250,000 in gold, or about $4.5 million today, for these lots on the southeast corner of Wall and Broad Streets. According to the New York Times, more money was paid for it than any other piece of ground of a similar area of which there is any record in any city in the world. On the property, Drexel Morgan and Company erected a modern 6-story French Second Empire building in gleaming white Vermont marble. Contemporary advertisements from 1873 for office space available for lease in the new building mentioned its state-of-the-art features, including 2 elevators, 2 staircases, fireproof construction, well ventilated and lighted, heated by steam, and every modern convenience on each floor. After Drexel's death in 1893, Drexel Morgan and Company was renamed J.P. Morgan and Company. And if you look closely, you can see the name of the new firm emblazoned over the corner entrance. Of course, it goes without saying that J.P. Morgan was a tremendous success. So successful, in fact, that the building was simply referred to as the corner. In February 1912, Mr. Morgan organized the Drexel Building Corporation for the sole purpose of buying out the Drexel heirs and redeveloping the corner itself. The real estate transaction netted the Drexel family about $3 million, which made the corner the most valuable site per square foot of any real estate in New York at the time. Morgan hired the architectural partnership of Trowbridge and Livingston to design a new House of Morgan, but it was to be a rather austere, squat structure constructed from Tennessee marble. Its size was planned to be a stunning contrast to the new modern skyscrapers that were being constructed nearby. It was a subtle move on Morgan's part that broadcasted the power of his financial institution that could afford to construct a new headquarters building that provided no income whatsoever to its owner. Morgan, however, would not live to see his new building. On Monday, March 31st, 1913, Morgan died in his sleep while traveling abroad. Nevertheless, 2.5 months later, on June 14th, the New York Times reported, in a few days, the most valuable piece of real estate in the United States will be nothing but a vacant lot surrounded by a board fence. Construction on the new House of Morgan began that summer, as seen here in this photograph from Monday, July 28th, 1913. Now, I should point out that unlike the old Drexel building, J.P. Morgan's name was nowhere to be found on the exterior of the new headquarters. So why advertise when everyone knows who you are and where you're located? Simply known today as number 23 Wall Street, it has been designated an individual landmark by the New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission and has been listed on the National Register of Historic Places. Today, the building is currently vacant. That's it hiding behind the scaffolding in the center of this photograph I took last week. Its future remains uncertain. Secret number 7, the Merchants Exchange. After the building was sold to the National City Bank, the bank hired Charles McKim of McKim, Mead & White in 1907 to expand and renovate the old building as the bank's new headquarters. It was one of the first commissions McKim, Mead & White received following the untimely death of Stanford White the year before. McKim drew his inspiration from the colonnade of Isaiah Rogers' 1842 building, which was in the Ionic order, and added a fantastic upper colonnade in correct proportions and most appropriately executed in the Corinthian order. On the South William Street and Hanover Street elevations, McKim inserted large arched windows to compensate for daylight that was lost when the old roof and dome were removed. The fenestration of the upper floors provided ample light for modern offices. Now, thanks to historic photographs like this one from the collection of the New York Public Library, which documents the early construction of number 63 Wall Street, the former Brown Brothers building, we can get a full view of the Merchants Exchange expanded Hanover Street elevation, a view we cannot get today. Charles McKim also completely gutted the interior and created a new monumental banking hall featuring architectural elements similar to those found at Pennsylvania Station, perhaps the firm's most famous commission, then also under construction in Midtown. The final result was truly stunning. This is a view of the building from across Wall Street from the late 1970s. The parking lot in the foreground will soon be occupied by a new skyscraper, but from this perspective, it's really hard to tell where the old Rogers building stops and the new McKim Mead and White building begins. I should also mention that not only is the building an individual landmark, the interior has also been designated a landmark, and today it's used as an event space. Secret number 8, the Bank of the United States, New York branch. Of all the buildings on Wall Street, I think this one holds many hidden secrets, but since we're limited on time this afternoon, I will give you just a few of the highlights. Number 30 Wall Street has gone by several names over the years, but the New York branch of the Second Bank of the United States, seen in this drawing from 1827 by Alexander Jackson Davis, was designed by Martin Euclid Thompson, who later designed the Arsenal in Central Park. Here on Wall Street, Thompson was commissioned by the Second Bank of the United States to construct a branch office on a parcel of land that the bank had purchased for $40,000 from the Verplanck family, who owned the property since the 1860s. Montgomery Schuyler once described the style of this building as of that modernized Roman, which in England is known as Georgian, and in this country as colonial. But after the demise of the Second Bank of the United States in 1837, the bank sold the building to the United States federal government for $530,000 for use as the new United States Assay Office. Here's a great photograph of the Assay Office on the right with Federal Hall. But by the end of the 19th century, the building was beginning to show signs of some serious structural problems. Beams were installed to shore up the western elevation. And when a new refinery was built behind it on Pine Street in 1911, the Wall Street Assay Office operations were vacated. As the abandoned building fell into further disrepair, plans were made for it to be razed. Wall Street financier Henry Clues lamented at the time, "The building is the best example of architecture in the city, except for City Hall, and I shall be very sorry to see it go." Well, it did go, so to speak. Fortunately, at least part of the landmark was saved in 1915 when the United States government donated the facade to Robert DeForest, then the president of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, who arranged for the facade to be carefully stripped away from the building, the pieces individually cataloged and stored away. 7 years later, in 1922, the pieces were moved uptown to the museum, where the facade was reassembled as the new entrance for the early American art wing, then under construction. The end result was a rather grand entrance into a museum featuring Americana. Today, the facade is on permanent display in one of my favorite spots in the Met, in the center of the New American Wing. It is a superb example of architecture as fine art. Secret number 9, the tallest building in the world. In 1929, automobile magnate Walter P. Chrysler hired William Van Allen to design the tallest building in the world. But Van Allen wasn't the only New York architect that was designing the tallest building in the world that year. In fact, his former business partner and former best friend, H. Craig Severance, had just been hired by George Ostrom to design a 47-story tower for the Bank of Manhattan at number 40 Wall Street. And New York became witness to the race to the sky. But the Wall Street part of this story surrounds several lots on the north side of the street between Nassau and William Street that were then occupied by several smaller buildings dating from the late 19th century. On Wednesday, April 10th, 1929, the New York Times announced that Severance's building was going to be the world's loftiest building, and construction began the following month. And for the next 12 months, 2,300 workers were employed, working 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, to build the 70-story building. When construction officially ended on Thursday, May 1st, 1930, the price tag was a staggering $24 million, a significant expenditure for the bank during the early months of the Great Depression. The interior spaces were finished to house the bank's operations, including these massive bank vaults in the basement. And this room with its majestic black marble Ionic columns, in which customers could comfortably transact bank business. As a footnote, I should mention that these spaces are not designated interior landmarks. In fact, today it is a Duane Reade. I actually bought my lunch here just the other day. 40 Wall Street is Art Deco in style, but with distinctive Gothic style architectural elements. Here is a photograph of the roofline, which shows some of those elements, most notably the dormers, the lantern and its spire. But when that spire, which is 60 feet tall, was set in place on Wednesday, November 13th, 1929, 40 Wall Street officially topped out at 925 feet above Wall Street. And as its architect, Craig Severance, had planned, 40 Wall Street became the tallest building in the world. Of course, we all know that 40 Wall Street soon thereafter lost that title to the 1,046-foot tall Chrysler Building. And secret number 10, J.P. Morgan. If this was an architectural history survey class, it would be at this point that I would begin a lecture on postmodernism and would use the building at 60 Wall Street to illustrate this style of architecture that first emerged in the late 1960s as a reaction to the mid-century modern austerity in architectural design. Postmodernism called for a return to ornamentation, and architects freely borrowed elements from classical architecture for modern interpretation, sometimes not too successfully. But in the case of 60 Wall Street, the architects Kevin Roach and John Dinkeloo were hired by J.P. Morgan and Company to design their new headquarters building. And they drew inspiration from the architectural history of Wall Street. As Paul Goldberger pointed out at the time, the architects turned classicism into something sleek and modern. This tower of gray granite and reflective glass mimics the form of a classical column, but it does so in such a way as to reinvigorate historical form with modern meaning. But here the cost of modernity was the demolition of several late 19th and early 20th century buildings. This detail from a map from 1955 gives you a sense of scale of the demolition for one modern skyscraper. And here's an aerial photograph from 1930 showing those blocks of buildings. Among the buildings that was lost was this one in the foreground at number 52 Wall Street, the National City Bank building by McKim, Mead and White. It's that one with the little Ionic temple on the roof. Completed in 1928, after McKim, Mead and White had all departed the firm, the 432-foot tall tower was certainly a building in which I think the partners would have been proud. Seen here in another aerial photograph, unfortunately, by 1986, the classically inspired building with its Greek temple mounted on its roof was deemed to be functionally obsolete and demolished along with its neighbors. But one of the neighbors actually survived. This is the Bank of New York and Trust building by Benjamin Wistar Morris, immediately to the west of number 60 Wall Street at number 48. The photographs, of course, will give you a present-day perspective of the old Bank of New York and the postmodern 60 Wall Street. But I think the real hidden secret here can be found at number 48 Wall Street on the top. It's a fantastic Art Deco style copper eagle perched atop a globe representing the state of New York. It's one of those amazing works of art that you really don't get to see from the sidewalk. So there you have it, my top 10 hidden secrets of Wall Street. I hope I've inspired you this afternoon to go out for a walk and explore Wall Street for yourselves, and be on the lookout for some other secrets of Wall Street hidden in plain sight. We're going to take some questions now.
Glenn, as of now, no. Oh, here's one. As usual, very informative talk, but I wonder why there is no mention of enslaved labor and its role in building Wall Street. I know time is short, so perhaps this is a topic for a future talk or tour.
Yep, that's going to be a future talk.
Great. And so far, that's our only question.
Okay.
If anyone else has any questions, please feel free to put it in the Q&A.
And to give everybody a heads up, we will be sending out the link to the recording at some point, either late today or tomorrow. So you can certainly watch the link again at your leisure.
Yes.
No other questions?
Another one just came in. What do you believe is the biggest historical architectural loss on Wall Street and the surrounding area?
Biggest loss. I think it's actually going to be the assay office. Fortunately, we had the facade at the Met, but at the Met, it's really out of its historic context. It was really designed to be on Wall Street. So in that aspect, I think that one's probably the greatest loss. Even though I do like going to the Met and seeing it up close and personal.
Any other questions for Glenn?
Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
I'm just wondering if you might say a few words about the shoot 'em up on Good Friday at the Morgan Building.
Yes, so I'll just mention that there's some damage on the Morgan Building on the Wall Street elevation. It's a really interesting story that I was going to include today, but I wanted to save it for another lecture. So stay tuned. I want to talk about that in a future lecture. So there was a reason why I didn't want to include that, but there is some damage from a group of anarchists that still is visible on Wall Street.
A couple more questions.
Okay.
Where in Trinity Church should I look to find the secret?
Oh, that's your homework assignment. So I'm going to play bad professor and not tell you exactly where it is. But I will give you a hint. If you go into Trinity Wall Street, it won't take you long to find it if you know where to look. So that's your, I always like to give homework on these tours, so I think I'll leave that as your homework assignment.
Next question is One Broadway an historic building?
One Broadway. I think the question might be asking about One Wall Street. So if the person asking the question can clarify a little bit more which building that is, because One Broadway is a different building, and I think they might be talking about One Wall Street, both of which are landmarks, by the way.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, I was asking about One Broadway, which is a Citibank building now that used to be an old shipping building.
That's right. I'm going to, if you can send me a deeper question as to what you want by email. It's actually outside of the scope of my tour today, because it's not, I was limiting the tour to Wall Street, but it's a fantastic building that has quite a story. You know, you've probably heard of the adage that Washington slept here. Washington actually worked on that lot at one point. But it's a rather fascinating building that's got a complicated story attached to it. In fact, I'm looking at it right now at my office window. But it's a designated landmark building, and was initially, you know, built for the shipping industry.
Next question, was the space that New York Sports Club now occupies, what was the space that New York Sports Club now occupies? It looks like a former bank building in the interior.
The New York Sports Club on Wall Street has been closed. I used to go to the gym there years ago. But yes, that was a banking hall in that building. When the gym moved in, they really didn't do much to alter the interior. So you went up to the mezzanine for certain of the workout equipment. But yes, that was a banking hall. Of course, now the space has been empty, and there's nothing in there right now.
Another question, speaking of One Wall Street, can you talk about the lobby mural?
The lobby mural is absolutely fantastic. I did a walking tour, and I'm sorry, I forget when that was, last year, maybe a year and a half ago, of Rockefeller Center. And the mural was actually done by Hildreth Mier, and it's over the top. Unfortunately, I haven't seen it in several years, so I can't comment on what it looks like today. I know it's up for restoration and they're protecting it. But it's one of those lobbies where, you know, you walk in and you're just gobsmacked. It's that gorgeous. But the artist is Hildreth Mier. And, you know, her work is found in several places here in New York City, but I think of all the work that she's done in New York City, that's probably the masterpiece.
And that was our last question. Just one comment saying, bravo, Glenn, many thanks.
Okay, thank you. All right, well, I'm so glad everyone was able to join us this afternoon. Thank you for spending a little bit of time of your afternoon with us this afternoon. Like I said, we'll be sending out a link to the presentation you can watch at your leisure. But thank you for coming, and I hope to see you on a future Explore New York walking tour. Hopefully soon we'll be out in person again as a group. So have a great afternoon.